There is a case file in the archives of Memorial Hospital in New York City that should have changed everything. The patient was a German immigrant named Fred Stein. He arrived at the hospital in 1884 with a tumor the size of a fist growing from his jaw. The surgeons removed it twice. It came back twice. They told him there was nothing more to do and sent him home to die. Then Stein contracted erysipelas, a streptococcal skin infection, and developed a raging fever that lasted several days. The tumor shrank. By the time the infection cleared, it was gone. Not smaller. Gone. Stein lived for another 8 years. A young surgeon on staff read those records and could not make himself look away. His name was William Coley. He was 29 years old, 7 years out of Harvard Medical School, and he had just found documentation of something his scalpel had failed to do twice to the same patient. He spent the next 45 years trying to understand why. The treatments he developed from that single case file achieved results that oncologists today describe as extraordinary. Several have called him the father of immunotherapy. His name does not appear in most medical school curricula. It was not suppressed in any dramatic sense. It was simply made unnecessary, classification by classification, institution by institution, until the knowledge sat in a box and the box sat in a room, and nobody with the authority to open it had any financial reason to do so. Before 1890, cancer treatment was almost entirely surgical. If a tumor was accessible, you cut it out. If it was not accessible, or if it came back, there was nothing to offer. Memorial Hospital, then called the New York Cancer Hospital, founded in 1884, was among the first institutions in the Western world dedicated exclusively to cancer patients. Coley joined its surgical staff in 1891. He was ambitious and precise, and his closest patient, a young socialite named Bessie Dashiell, had just died of a bone sarcoma he had failed to catch early enough. Her death affected him enough that he began searching the hospital's old case files for any recorded instance of spontaneous remission in cancer. He found 17 documented cases. In case after case, the pattern was the same. A cancer patient contracts a serious bacterial infection, develops a high sustained fever, and recovers from both the infection and the tumor. The connection appeared too consistent to be coincidence. Coley began writing to the attending physicians of each case to verify the records. Then he tracked down Fred Stein, who was still alive in Lower Manhattan, 8 years after the surgeons at his own hospital had sent him home to die. Coley's hypothesis was not mystical. It was mechanical. He believed the immune system, when activated violently by infection, was capable of recognizing and destroying cancer cells. The fever was not the cure. The fever was the signal. Something the fever triggered. Something in the body's inflammatory response was targeting the tumor. If he could provoke that response without the lethal risk of an active infection, he might be able to replicate the effect reliably across patients. He began by injecting live streptococcal bacteria directly into patients with inoperable tumors. Some responded dramatically. Some nearly died from the infections themselves. Over years of refinement, he developed what became known as Coley's toxins, a mixture of killed Streptococcus pyogenes and Serratia marcescens calibrated to provoke a strong immune response without active disease. He administered the treatments at Memorial Hospital and at other institutions across the next 4 decades. The results he documented were not modest. He reported complete, durable remissions in patients with inoperable sarcomas, lymphomas, and carcinomas, cancers that surgery could not reach. His records showed patients given months to live, treated with the toxins and still alive 10 and 20 years later. He was not working in a basement. He was on the surgical staff of a major New York City cancer hospital, treating patients whose cases were documented in institutional records, whose outcomes were trackable, whose survival was verifiable. This was not folklore. It was filed paperwork. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. By 1903, hospitals were using radiation to treat cancer. By the 1920s, radiation therapy had become the dominant mode of treatment in America, and the men who controlled Memorial Hospital had decided it was the future. The leading pathologist at the hospital was James Ewing. He was a radiation advocate and Coley's immediate superior. Ewing believed that bacterial toxins were primitive, uncontrolled, and incompatible with the scientific image that modern medicine needed to project. The stated reason for his opposition was that Coley's results were not reproducible under standardized conditions. The real concern was something less abstract. Coley's method did not require the machines that Ewing's department controlled. It did not require the physical infrastructure that radiation therapy demanded. It did not generate the institutional revenue that capital equipment generates. It required a physician who understood the protocol, a supply of killed bacteria, and a patient willing to tolerate a controlled fever. Ewing did not publish a refutation of Coley's data. He did not design trials to test it. He made clear within the hierarchy of the hospital that bacterial toxins were not the direction Memorial was pursuing. After Coley's death in 1936, Memorial Hospital stopped offering the treatment entirely. The formula was not studied further. The case files were not analyzed. 45 years of documented results were boxed up and stored. The American Medical Association's Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry functioned in this period as the de facto national arbiter of what treatments were legitimate. Treatments it did not endorse, could not appear in the AMA's advertising-supported journals, could not be taught in medical schools without professional risk to faculty, and could not be marketed to the public as medical interventions. Coley's toxins never received council endorsement. The objections given were procedurally correct. No randomized trials, no standardized dosing protocol, no mechanistic explanation. These objections were also procedurally impossible to satisfy with a treatment that required individual calibration, that had been developed 30 years before controlled trial methodology became a professional standard, and whose mechanism, immune activation against tumor tissue, remained poorly understood for another 6 decades. Then, in the mid-1960s, the American Cancer Society made it official. Coley's toxins were added to their list of unproven methods of cancer management. That list was not a neutral catalogue of understudied treatments. It was a blacklist, and it functioned like one. Physicians who prescribed treatments on the list risked losing hospital privileges. Insurance companies denied coverage. Medical schools used it as a guide for what to exclude. Coley's name did not disappear from the historical record. It was made professionally dangerous to engage with, which, in medicine, accomplishes the same thing. Coley's daughter, Helen Coley Nortz, did not accept that framing. She was not a physician. She was a trained researcher, and she spent the better part of her adult life doing something that no one at Memorial Hospital had bothered to do after her father died. She read his case files. All of them. Over 3 decades, she reviewed more than 1,000 documented cases, traced outcomes through hospital records, follow-up correspondence, and death certificates, and codified them into a systematic analysis. She founded the Cancer Research Institute in 1953, specifically to preserve and advance this work. Her published findings were difficult to dismiss on scientific grounds. In a cohort of patients with inoperable soft tissue sarcomas, a cancer type with historically dismal prognosis, she documented long-term survival rates that compared favorably with what surgery and radiation achieved in operable cases of the same disease. In some tumor types, the remission rates in her father's records exceeded anything the medical establishment of the 1960s could offer with its current methods. The monographs were reviewed. They were described as retrospective and uncontrolled. The ACS classification was not revised. Those criticisms were not wrong. They were not applied symmetrically. Radiation therapy had been adopted as the standard of care, on the basis of evidence that was, by later standards, equally limited. The difference was not the quality of the data, it was the timing, the institutional alignment, and the equipment the treatment required. Lloyd Old, an immunologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering who later became one of the most respected figures in cancer immunology, wrote about Coley extensively in his later career. Old argued that the abandonment of Coley's work represented one of the most consequential errors in the history of oncology, not because Coley's methods were perfect, but because the immune mechanism he had empirically identified was real, and 6 decades of institutional silence around it had cost time that cannot be returned. Then came October 2018. The Nobel Committee in Stockholm awarded the prize in physiology or medicine to James Allison of the MD Anderson Cancer Center and Tasuku Honjo of Kyoto University. The prize was for their work on cancer therapy through inhibition of negative immune regulation, the mechanism behind checkpoint inhibitor drugs, now used to treat melanoma, lung cancer, bladder cancer, and a growing list of other malignancies. These treatments work by releasing the brakes on the immune system, allowing it to recognize and attack cancer cells. In principle, this is the same thing William Coley was attempting with bacterial toxins in 1895. He was provoking the immune system to activate. Allison and Honjo discovered why that activation sometimes fails, and how to restore it. Allison acknowledged the lineage publicly following the prize. A peer-reviewed analysis published in the Journal of Translational Medicine examined Coley's documented cases against modern immunological criteria and found the remissions he reported were consistent with immune-mediated tumor regression. The paper noted that had Coley's approach been preserved and developed rather than abandoned in the 1930s, immune-based cancer therapy might have arrived as a clinical standard 50 years earlier than it did. 50 years. Allow yourself to calculate what that means in cancer deaths per year in any single country. And do not look away from the number you reach. I sat with this research for nearly 3 weeks before I wrote a single word, not because the evidence was difficult to find, because it was too clean. The mechanism that explains Coley's results was confirmed by the Nobel Committee in 2018. The Nobel Prize is not awarded for fringe science, and yet in the year that immunotherapy received the highest honor in medicine, Coley's name appeared in almost none of the mainstream coverage of the prize. The New York Times ran a feature on Allison and Honjo. Coley was not mentioned. The hospital where he spent his career was not mentioned. The classification that sat on his work for 30 years was not mentioned. I kept asking myself what it would take for a fact this well documented to receive this little attention, and the answer, when I finally let myself follow it, was the part that troubled me most. The global oncology pharmaceutical market was valued at approximately $300 billion in 2023. The checkpoint inhibitor drugs that vindicate Coley's core principle, pembrolizumab, nivolumab, ipilimumab, together generate tens of billions in annual revenue. These are not modest treatments. A single course of pembrolizumab for non-small cell lung cancer can cost $200,000 per year. The immunotherapy market is one of the fastest growing sectors in medicine. The patents that govern it are among the most valuable intellectual property in the world. Coley's toxins, in their original form, could be produced from killed bacteria for a cost measured in dollars per dose. Coley administered them free of charge to patients who could not pay. The treatment did not require proprietary molecules, patent-protected synthesis, or infusion centers that bill by the hour. It required a physician who understood the protocol and a patient willing to tolerate a controlled fever. There is no revenue model for that. There is no quarterly earnings report that benefits from it. There is no licensing board whose authority expands when it is validated. This is not a conspiracy. I want to be careful with that word because it implies coordination, and what I see here is something different. Something that might be worse. The ACS did not classify Coley's work as unproven because anyone feared his results. They classified it because it did not fit the methodological framework they had adopted, and because the institutions that shaped their funding were invested in treatments that required a different infrastructure. The physicians who stopped teaching Coley did not suppress him deliberately. They were trained inside curricula that had already removed him before they arrived. Nobody sat in a room and decided to bury the father of immunotherapy. They built systems that had no financial reason to remember him, and the systems did the work by themselves. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A treatment works. The public it works on has no institutional voice. The institutions that could evaluate it have financial relationships with competing treatments. The mechanism is not yet understood, so it cannot be explained in the language the credentialing system requires. It is classified as unproven, which is not the same as disproven, but which functions identically in every clinical, educational, and insurance context that matters. And then the mechanism is finally understood, 50 or 100 years later, and the same institutional system that buried the original work takes credit for discovering the principle. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The hospital where Coley worked is still standing. Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, what was once the New York Cancer Hospital where Fred Stein's case file sat in a drawer, is now one of the world's leading cancer treatment institutions. It offers checkpoint immunotherapy. It does not offer Coley's toxins. On its institutional history page, William Coley appears in a single sentence. His daughter spent 40 years in a building 1 mile from that hospital, reading his case files by hand, writing monographs that no one assigned to medical students. She died in 2001 at the age of 93. The Cancer Research Institute she founded still operates. It funds immunotherapy research that would not exist without her work. Her name, like her father's, appears in almost none of the press coverage generated by the field she spent her life preserving. Fred Stein lived in Lower Manhattan for 8 years after the doctors who treated him decided there was nothing more to do. The tumor that surgery had failed to remove twice was gone before he died. William Coley found his case file, tracked him down, and spent his career trying to understand what Stein's body had already known how to do. The knowledge Coley assembled is not hidden. His case files are at the Cancer Research Institute. His daughter's monographs are in medical libraries. The Nobel Committee cited the same principle he built his career on. The journals that vindicate him are freely accessible online. They are simply not taught. The ACS Unproven Methods list was discontinued and renamed in 1990. Coley's toxins were quietly removed from it sometime in the following decade. No announcement, no correction, no accounting of what the classification cost in years, in trials not run, in patients not treated. The treatment is now described in academic reviews as an early and intuitive form of immunotherapy that was unfortunately never properly studied. The man spent 45 years studying it. His daughter spent 40 years studying his studies. The Nobel Prize was awarded for studying the same principle in 2018. How do you not properly study something for 130 years? What else sits in a box in a hospital archive, waiting for the field to catch up to a single patient whose tumor was already gone before anyone thought to ask why? The case file is still there. The question is still there. The only thing missing is anyone with the authority and the incentive to take both of them seriously at the same time.